Chapter 4 of Joe's Boys by Louisa May Alcott. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Joe's Boys by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 4. Dan. Mrs. Joe often thought that Dan had Indian blood in him, not only because of his love of a wild, wandering life, but his appearance, for as he grew up this became more striking. At 25 he was very tall, with sinewy limbs, a keen, dark face, and the alert look of one whose senses were all alive, rough in manner, full of energy, quick with word and blow, eyes full of the old fire, always watchful as if used to keep guard, and a general air of vigor and freshness very charming to those who knew the dangers and delights of his adventurous life. He was looking his best as he sat talking with Mother Bear, one strong brown hand in hers, and a world of affection in his voice as he said,
"Forget old friends? How could I forget the only home I ever knew? Why, I was in such a hurry to come and tell my good luck that I didn't stop to fix up, you see, though I knew you'd think I looked more like a wild buffalo than ever."
With a shake of his shaggy black head, a tug at his beard, and a laugh that made the room ring.
"I like it. I always had a fancy for banditti, and you look just like one. Mary, being a newcomer, was frightened at your looks and manners. Josie won't know you, but Ted will recognize his Danny in spite of the big beard and flowing mane. They will all be here soon to welcome you, so before they come, tell me more about yourself. Why, Dan, dear, it's nearly 2 years since you were here. Has it gone well with you?"
asked Mrs. Joe, who had been listening with maternal interest to his account of life in California and the unexpected success of a small investment he had made.
"First rate. I don't care for the money, you know. I only want a trifle to pay my way. Rather earn as I go, and not be bothered with the care of a lot. It's the fun of the thing coming to me, and my being able to give away that I like. No use to lay up. I shan't live to be old and need it. My sort never do,"
said Dan, looking as if his little fortune rather oppressed him.
"But if you marry and settle somewhere, as I hope you will, you must have something to begin with, my son. So be prudent and invest your money. Don't give it away, for rainy days come to us all, and dependence would be very hard for you to bear,"
answered Mrs. Joe with a sage air, though she liked to see that the money-making fever had not seized her lucky boy yet. Dan shook his head and glanced about the room as if he already found it rather confined and longed for all out of doors again.
"Who would marry a jack-o'-lantern like me? Women like a steady-going man. I shall never be that."
"My dear boy, when I was a girl I liked just such adventurous fellows as you are. Anything fresh and daring, free and romantic, is always attractive to us womenfolk. Don't be discouraged. You'll find an anchor some day, and be content to take shorter voyages and bring home a good cargo."
"What should you say if I brought you an Indian squaw some day?"
asked Dan, with a glimmer of mischief in the eyes that rested on a marble bust of Galatea, gleaming white and lovely in the corner.
"Welcome her heartily, if she was a good one. Is there prospect of it?"
And Mrs. Joe peered at him with the interest which even literary ladies take in love affairs.
"Not at present, thank you. I'm too busy to gallivant, as Ted calls it. How is the boy?"
asked Dan, skillfully turning the conversation, as if he had had enough of sentiment. Mrs. Joe was off at once, and expatiated upon the talents and virtues of her sons till they came bursting in and fell upon Dan like two affectionate young bears, finding a vent for their joyful emotions in a sort of friendly wrestling match, in which both got worsted, of course, for the hunter soon settled them. The professor followed, and tongues went like mill clappers, while Mary lighted up, and cook devoted herself to an unusually good supper, instinctively divining that this guest was a welcome one. After tea Dan was walking up and down the long rooms as he talked, with occasional trips into the hall for a fresher breath of air, his lungs seeming to need more than those of civilized people. In one of these trips he saw a white figure framed in the dark doorway, and paused to look at it. Bess paused also, not recognizing her old friend, and quite unconscious of the pretty picture she made standing, tall and slender, against the soft gloom of the summer night, with her golden hair like a halo round her head, and the ends of a white shawl blown out, like wings, by the cool wind sweeping through the hall.
"Is it Dan?"
she asked, coming in with a gracious smile and outstretched hand.
Looks like it, but I didn't know you, Princess. I thought it was a spirit,"
answered Dan, looking down at her with a curious softness and wonder in his face.
"I've grown very much, but 2 years have changed you entirely."
And Bess looked up with girlish pleasure at the picturesque figure before her, for it was a decided contrast to the well-dressed people about her. Before they could say more, Josie rushed in, and, forgetful of the newly acquired dignity of her teens, let Dan catch her up and kiss her like a child. Not till he set her down did he discover she also was changed, and exclaimed, in comic dismay,
"Hello! Why, you are growing up too! What am I going to do, with no young one to play with? Here's Ted going it like a beanstalk, and Bess a young lady, and even you, my mustard seed, letting down your frocks and putting on airs."
The girls laughed, and Josie blushed as she stared at the tall man, conscious that she had leaped before she looked. They made a pretty contrast, these two young cousins, one as fair as a lily, the other a little wild rose, and Dan gave a nod of satisfaction as he surveyed them, for he had seen many bonny girls in his travels, and was glad that these old friends were blooming so beautifully.
Here, we can't allow any monopoly of Dan.
Called Mrs. Joe.
Bring him back, and keep an eye on him, or he will be slipping off for another little run of a year or two before we have half seen him.
Led by these agreeable captors, Dan returned to the parlor to receive a scolding from Josie for getting ahead of all the other boys and looking like a man first.
Emil is older, but he's only a boy and dances jigs and sings sailor songs just as he used to. You look about 30 and as big and black as a villain in a play. Oh, I've got a splendid idea. You are just the thing for our bosses in the last days of Pompeii. We want to act it, have the lion and the gladiators and the eruption. Tom and Ted are going to shower bushels of ashes down and roll barrels of stones about. We wanted a dark man for the Egyptian, and you will be gorgeous in red and white shawls, won't he, Aunt Joe?
This deluge of words made Dan clap his hands over his ears, and before Mrs. Bear could answer her impetuous niece, the Lawrences, with Meg and her family, arrived, soon followed by Tom and Nan, and all sat down to listen to Dan's adventures, told in brief yet effective manner, as the varying expressions of interest, wonder, merriment, and suspense painted on the circle of faces round him plainly showed. The boys all wanted to start at once for California and make fortunes. The girls could hardly wait for the curious and pretty things he had picked up for them in his travels, while the elders rejoiced heartily over the energy and good prospects of their wild boy.
"Of course you will want to go back for another stroke of luck, and I hope you will have it. But speculation is a dangerous game, and you may lose all you've won,"
said Mr. Lorry, who had enjoyed the stirring tale as much as any of the boys, and would have liked to rough it with Dan as well as they.
"I've had enough of it, for a while at least. Too much like gambling. Excitement is all I care for, and it isn't good for me. I have a notion to try farming at West. It's grand on a large scale, and I feel as if steady work would be rather jolly after loafing around so long. I can make a beginning, and you can send me your black sheep to stock my place with. I tried sheep farming in Australia, and know something about black ones anyway."
A laugh chased away the sober look in Dan's face as he ended, and those who knew him best guessed that he had learned a lesson there in San Francisco and dared not try again.
That is a capital idea, Dan.
cried Mrs. Joe, seeing great hope in this desire to fix himself somewhere and help others.
We shall know where you are, and can go and see you, and not have half the world between us. I'll send my Ted for a visit. He's such a restless spirit, it would do him good. With you he would be safe while he worked off his surplus energies and learned a wholesome business.
I'll use the shovel and the hoe like a good one, if I get a chance out there. But the Speranza mines sound rather jollier,"
said Ted, examining the samples of ore Dan had brought for the professor.
"You go and start a new town, and when we are ready to swarm we will come out and settle there. You will want a newspaper very soon, and I like the idea of running one myself much better than grinding away as I do now,"
observed Demi, panting to distinguish himself in the journalistic line.
"We could easily plant a new college there. These sturdy Westerners are hungry for learning and very quick to see and choose the best,"
added ever-young Mr. March, beholding with his prophetic eye many duplicates of their own flourishing establishment springing up in the wide West.
Go on, Dan. It is a fine plan, and we will back you up. I shouldn't mind investing in a few prairies and cowboys myself,"
said Mr. Lorry, always ready to help the lads to help themselves, both by his cheery words and ever-open purse.
A little money sort of ballasts a fellow, and investing it in land anchors him, for a while at least. I'd like to see what I can do, but I thought I'd consult you before I decided. Have my doubts about it suiting me for many years, but I can cut loose when I'm tired,"
answered Dan, both touched and pleased at the eager interest of these friends in his plans.
"I know you won't like it. After having the whole world to roam over, one farm will seem dreadfully small and stupid,"
said Josie, who much preferred the romance of the wandering life which brought her thrilling tales and pretty things at each return.
Is there any art out there?
asked Bess, thinking what a good study in black and white Dan would make as he stood talking, half turned from the light.
"Plenty of nature, dear, and that is better. You will find splendid animals to model, and scenery such as you never saw in Europe to paint. Even prosaic pumpkins are grand out there. You can play Cinderella in one of them, Josie, when you open your theatre in Dansville,"
said Mr. Lorry, anxious that no cold water should be thrown on the new plan. Stage-struck Josie was caught at once, and being promised all the tragic parts on the yet unbuilt stage, she felt a deep interest in the project, and begged Dan to lose no time in beginning his experiment. Bess also confessed that studies from nature would be good for her, and wild scenery improve her taste, which might grow over-nice if only the delicate and beautiful were set before her.
"I speak for the practice of the new town,"
said Nan, always eager for fresh enterprises.
"I shall be ready by the time you get well started. Towns grow so fast out there."
Dan isn't going to allow any woman under 40 in his place. He doesn't like them, especially young and pretty ones,"
put in Tom, who was raging with jealousy because he read admiration for Nan in Dan's eyes.
"That won't affect me because doctors are exceptions to all rules. There won't be much sickness in Dansville. Everyone will lead such active, wholesome lives, and only energetic young people will go there. But accidents will be frequent, owing to wild cattle, fast riding, Indian scrimmages, and the recklessness of Western life. That will just suit me. I long for broken bones. Surgery's so interesting, and I get so little here,"
answered Nan, yearning to put out her shingle and begin.
"I'll have you, Doctor, and be glad of such a good sample of what we can do in the East. Peg away, and I'll send for you as soon as I have a roof to cover you. I'll scalp a few red fellows, or smash up a dozen or so of cowboys for your special benefit,"
laughed Dan, well pleased with the energy and fine physique which made Nan a conspicuous figure among other girls.
"Thanks, I'll come. Would you just let me feel your arm? Splendid biceps. Now, boys, see here, this is what I call muscle."
And Nan delivered a short lecture with Dan's sinewy arm to illustrate it. Tom retired to the alcove and glowered at the stars, while he swung his own right arm with a vigor suggestive of knocking someone down.
"Make Tom sexton. He'll enjoy burying the patients Nan kills. He's trying to get up the glum expression proper to the business. Don't forget him, Dan."
said Ted, directing attention to the blighted being in the corner. But Tom never sulked long, and came out from his brief eclipse with the cheerful proposition,
Look here. We'll get the city to ship out to Dansville all the cases of yellow fever, smallpox, and cholera that arrive. Then Nan will be happy, and her mistakes won't matter much with emigrants and convicts.
I should advise settling near Jacksonville or some such city, that you might enjoy the society of cultivated persons. The Plato Club is there, and a most ardent thirst for philosophy. Everything from the East is welcomed hospitably, and new enterprises would flourish in such kindly soil,"
observed Mr. March, mildly offering a suggestion as he sat among the elders enjoying the lively scene. The idea of Dan studying Plato was very funny, but no one except naughty Ted smiled, and Dan made haste to unfold another plan seething in that active brain of his.
I'm not sure the farming will succeed, and have a strong leaning towards my old friends, the Montana Indians. They are a peaceful tribe, and need help awfully. Hundreds have died of starvation because they don't get their share. The Sioux are fighters, 30,000 strong, so government fears them and gives them all they want. I call that a damned shame."
Dan stopped short as the oath slipped out, but his eyes flashed, and he went on quickly.
"It is just that, and I won't beg pardon. If I'd had any money when I was there, I'd have given every cent to those poor devils, cheated out of everything, and waiting patiently, after being driven from their own land to places where nothing will grow. Now, honest agents could do much, and I've a feeling that I ought to go and lend a hand. I know their lingo, and I like 'em. I've got a few thousands, and I ain't sure I have any right to spend it on myself and settle down to enjoy it. Hey?"
Dan looked very manly and earnest as he faced his friends, flushed and excited by the energy of his words, and all felt that little thrill of sympathy which links hearts together by the tie of pity for the wronged.
Do it! Do it!
cried Mrs. Joe, fired at once, for misfortune was much more interesting to her than good luck.
Do it! Do it!
Echoed Ted, applauding as if at a play.
And take me along to help. I'm just raging to get among those fine fellows and hunt.
Let us hear more, and see if it is wise,
said Mr. Lorry, privately resolving to people his as yet unbought prairies with Montana Indians, and increase his donations to the society that sent missionaries to this much wronged people. Dan plunged at once into the history of what he saw among the Dakotas and other tribes in the Northwest, telling of their wrongs, patience, and courage as if they were his brothers.
"They called me Dan Firecloud, because my rifle was the best they ever saw. And Black Hawk was as good a friend as a fellow would want. Saved my life more than once, and taught me just what will be useful if I go back. They are down on their luck now, and I'd like to pay my debts."
By this time everyone was interested, and Dansville began to lose its charm, but prudent Mr. Bear suggested that one honest agent among many could not do much, and noble as the effort would be, it was wiser to think over the matter carefully, get influence and authority from the right quarters, and meantime look at lands before deciding.
"Well, I will. I'm going to take a run to Kansas and see how that promises. Met a fellow in Frisco who'd been there, and he spoke well of it. The fact is, there's so much to be done everywhere that I don't know where to catch on, and half wish I hadn't any money,"
answered Dan, knitting his brows in the perplexity all kind souls feel when anxious to help at the great task of the world's charity.
"I'll keep it for you till you decide. You're such an impetuous lad you'll give it to the first beggar that gets hold of you. I'll turn it over while you are prospecting, and hand it back when you are ready to invest. Shall I?"
asked Mr. Lorry, who had learned wisdom since the days of his own extravagant youth.
"Thank you, sir. I'd be glad to get rid of it. You just hold on till I say the word, and if anything happens to me this time, keep it to help some other scamp as you helped me. This is my will, and you all witness it. And now I feel better."
And Dan squared his shoulders as if relieved of a burden, after handing over the belt in which he carried his little fortune. No one dreamed how much was to happen before Dan came to take his money back, nor how nearly that act was his last will and testament, and while Mr. Lorry was explaining how he would invest it, a cheery voice was heard singing,
"Oh, Peggy was a jolly lassie, heave-ho, boys, heave-ho. She never grudged her Jack a glassie, heave-ho, boys, heave-ho. And when he sailed the raging main, she faithful was unto her swain, heave-ho, boys, heave-ho."
Emile always announced his arrival in that fashion, and in a moment he came hurrying in with Nat, who had been giving lessons in town all day. It was good to see the latter beam at his friend as he nearly shook his hand off. Better still to see how Dan gratefully remembered all he owed Nat, and tried to pay the debt in his rough way. And best of all, to hear the two travelers compare notes and reel off yarns to dazzle the landlubbers and home-keepers. After this addition the house would not contain the gay youngsters, so they migrated to the piazza and settled on the steps like a flock of night-loving birds. Mr. March and the professor retired to the study. Meg and Amy went to look after the little refection of fruit and cake which was to come, and Mrs. Joe and Mr. Lorry sat in the long window, listening to the chat that went on outside.
"There they are, the flower of our flock,"
she said, pointing to the group before them.
"The others are dead or scattered, but these 7 boys and 4 girls are my especial comfort and pride. Counting Alice Heath, my dozen is made up, and my hands are full trying to guide these young lives as far as human skill can do."
When we remember how different they are, from what some of them came and the home influences about others, I think we may feel pretty well satisfied so far,"
answered Mr. Lorry soberly, as his eyes rested on one bright head among the black and brown ones, for the young moon shone alike on all.
"I don't worry about the girls. Meg sees to them, and is so wise and patient and tender, they can't help doing well. But my boys are more care every year, and seem to drift farther away from me each time they go,"
sighed Mrs. Joe.
"They will grow up, and I can only hold them by one little thread, which may snap at any time, as it has with Jack and Ned. Dolly and George still like to come back, and I can say my word to them, and dear old Franz is too true to ever forget his own. But the 3 who are soon going out into the world again, I can't help worrying about. Emile's good heart will keep him straight, I hope. And a sweet little cherub sits up aloft to look out for the life of poor Jack. Nat is to make his first flight, and he's weak in spite of your strengthening influence. And Dan is still untamed. I fear it will take some hard lesson to do that."
"He's a fine fellow, Joe, and I almost regret this farming project. A little polish would make a gentleman of him, and who knows what he might become here among us,"
answered Mr. Lorry, leaning over Mrs. Bear's chair, just as he used to do years ago when they had mischievous secrets together.
"It wouldn't be safe, Teddy. Work and the free life he loves will make a good man of him, and that is better than any amount of polish, with the dangers an easy life in the city would bring him. We can't change his nature, only help it to develop in the right direction. The old impulses are there, and must be controlled, or he will go wrong. I see that. But his love for us is a safeguard, and we must keep a hold on him till he is older or has a stronger tie to help him."
Mrs. Joe spoke earnestly, for, knowing Dan better than anyone else, she saw that her colt was not thoroughly broken yet, and feared while she hoped, knowing that life would always be hard for one like him. She was sure that before he went away again, in some quiet moment, he would give her a glimpse of his inner self, and then she could say the word of warning or encouragement that he needed. So she bided her time, studying him meanwhile, glad to see all that was promising, and quick to detect the harm the world was doing him. She was very anxious to make a success of her firebrand, because others predicted failure, but having learned that people cannot be molded like clay, she contented herself with the hope that this neglected boy might become a good man, and asked no more. Even that was much to expect, so full was he of wayward impulses, strong passions, and the lawless nature born in him. Nothing held him but the one affection of his life, the memory of Plumfield, the fear of disappointing these faithful friends, the pride, stronger than principle, that made him want to keep the regard of the mates who always had admired and loved him in spite of all his faults.
Don't fret, old dear. Emile is one of those happy-go-lucky sort who always fall on their legs. I'll see to Nat, and Dan is in a good way now. Let him take a look at Kansas, and if the farm plan loses its charm, he can fall back on poor Lo and really do good out there. He's unusually fitted for that peculiar task, and I hope he'll decide to do it. Fighting oppressors and befriending the oppressed will keep those dangerous energies of his busy, and the life will suit him better than sheepfolds and wheat fields.
I hope so. What is that?
And Mrs. Joe leaned forward to listen as exclamations from Ted and Josie caught her ear.
A Mustang! A real live one! And we can ride it! Dan, you are a first-class trump!
Cried the boy.
A whole Indian dress for me! Now I can play Namioka if the boys act Metamora,
added Josie, clapping her hands.
A buffalo's head for Bess. Good gracious, Dan, why did you bring such a horrid thing as that?
Asked Nan.
Thought it would do her good to model something strong and natural. She'll never amount to anything if she keeps on making namby-pamby gods and pet kittens,
answered irreverent Dan, remembering that when he was last here, Bess was vibrating distractedly between a head of Apollo and her Persian cat as models.
Thank you, I'll try it. And if I fail, we can put the buffalo up in the hall to remind us of you,
said Bess, indignant at the insult offered the gods of her idolatry, but too well bred to show it except in her voice, which was as sweet and as cold as ice cream.
I suppose you won't come out to see our new settlement when the rest do. Too rough for you?
Asked Dan, trying to assume the deferential air all the boys used when addressing their princess.
I'm going to Rome to study for years. All the beauty and art of the world is there, and a lifetime isn't long enough to enjoy it,
answered Bess.
Rome is a moldy old tomb compared to the Garden of the Gods and my magnificent Rockies. I don't care a hang for art. Nature is as much as I can stand, and I guess I could show you things that would knock your old masters higher than kites. Better come, and while Josie rides the horses, you can model 'em. If a drove of 100 or so of wild ones can't show you beauty, I'll give up,
cried Dan, waxing enthusiastic over the wild grace and vigor which he could enjoy but had no power to describe.
I'll come some day with Papa, and see if they are better than the horses of St. Mark and those on Capitol Hill. Please don't abuse my gods, and I will try to like yours,
said Bess, beginning to think the West might be worth seeing, though no Raphael or Angelo had yet appeared there.
That's a bargain. I do think people ought to see their own country before they go scooting off to foreign parts, as if the New World wasn't worth discovering, began Dan, ready to bury the hatchet.
It has some advantages, but not all. The women of England can vote, and we can't. I'm ashamed of America that she isn't ahead in all good things,
cried Nan, who held advanced views on all reforms, and was anxious about her rights, having had to fight for some of them.
Oh, please don't begin on that. People always quarrel over that question, and call names, and never agree. Do let us be quiet and happy tonight,
pleaded Daisy, who hated discussion as much as Nan loved it.
You shall vote as much as you like in our new town, Nan. Be mayor and alderman, and run the whole concern. It's going to be as free as air, or I can't live in it,
said Dan, adding, with a laugh,
I see Mrs. Giddy-Gaddy and Mrs. Shakespeare Smith don't agree any better than they used to.
If everyone agreed, we should never get on. Daisy is a dear, but inclined to be an old fogey, so I stir her up, and next fall she will go and vote with me. Demi will escort us to do the one thing we are allowed to do as yet.
Will you take him, Deacon?
Asked Dan, using the old name as if he liked it.
It works capitally in Wyoming.
I shall be proud to do it. Mother and the aunts go every year, and Daisy will come with me. She is my better half still, and I don't mean to leave her behind in anything,"
said Demi, with an arm round his sister, of whom he was fonder than ever. Dan looked at them wistfully, thinking how sweet it must be to have such a tie, and his lonely youth seemed sadder than ever as he recalled its struggles. A gusty sigh from Tom made sentiment impossible, as he said pensively,
I always wanted to be a twin. It's so sociable and so cozy to have someone glad to lean on a fellow and comfort him, if other girls are cruel.
As Tom's unrequited passion was the standing joke of the family, this allusion produced a laugh, which Nan increased by whipping out a bottle of Nooks, saying, with her professional air,
I knew you ate too much lobster for tea. Take 4 pellets and your dyspepsia will be all right. Tom always sighs and is silly when he's overeaten.
I'll take 'em. These are the only sweet things you ever give me.
And Tom gloomily crunched his dose.
Who can minister to a mind diseased, or pluck out a rooted sorrow?
Quoted Josie tragically from her perch on the railing.
Come with me, Tommy, and I'll make a man of you. Drop your pills and powders, and cavort round the world a spell, and you'll soon forget you've got a heart or a stomach either,
said Dan, offering his one panacea for all ills.
Ship with me, Tom. A good fit of seasickness will set you up, and a stiff northeaster blow your blue devils away. Come along as surgeon. Easy berth, and no end of larks. And if your Nancy frowns, my lad, and scorns a jacket blue, just hoist your sails for other ports, and find a maid more true,
added Emile, who had a fragment of song to cheer every care and sorrow, and freely offered them to his friends.
Perhaps I'll think of it when I've got my diploma. I'm not going to grind 3 mortal years and have nothing to show for it. Till then...
I'll never desert Mrs. Micawber,
interrupted Teddy with a gurgling sob. Tom immediately rolled him off the step into the wet grass below, and by the time this slight skirmish was over, the jingle of teaspoons suggested refreshments of a more agreeable sort. In former times the little girls waited on the boys, to save confusion. Now the young men flew to serve the ladies, young and old, and that slight fact showed plainly how the tables were turned by time. And what a pleasant arrangement it was! Even Josie sat still, and let Emile bring her berries, enjoying her young ladyhood, till Ted stole her cake, when she forgot manners, and chastised him with a rap on the knuckles. As guest of honor, Dan was only allowed to wait on Bess, who still held the highest place in this small world. Tom carefully selected the best of everything for Nan, to be crushed by the remark,
I never eat at this hour, and you will have a nightmare if you do.
So, dutifully curbing the pangs of hunger, he gave the plate to Daisy, and chewed rose leaves for his supper. When a surprising quantity of wholesome nourishment had been consumed, someone said,
Let's sing.
And a tuneful hour followed. Nat fiddled, Demi piped, Dan strummed the old banjo, and Emile warbled a doleful ballad about the wreck of the Bounding Betsy. Then everybody joined in the old songs till there was very decidedly music in the air, and passers-by said, as they listened, smiling,
Old Plum is gay tonight.
When all had gone, Dan lingered on the piazza, enjoying the balmy wind that blew up from the hayfields and brought the breath of flowers from Parnassus. And as he leaned there romantically in the moonlight, Mrs. Joe came to shut the door.
Dreaming dreams, Dan?
She asked, thinking the tender moment might have come. Imagine the shock when, instead of some interesting confidence or affectionate word, Dan swung round, saying, bluntly,
I was wishing I could smoke.
Mrs. Joe laughed at the downfall of her hopes, and answered kindly,
You may, in your room, but don't set the house afire.
Perhaps Dan saw a little disappointment in her face, or the memory of the sequel of that boyish frolic touched his heart, for he stooped and kissed her, saying in a whisper,
Good night, Mother.
And Mrs. Joe was half satisfied. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Joe's Boys by Louisa May Alcott. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Joe's Boys by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 5, Vacation. Everyone was glad of a holiday next morning, and all lingered over the breakfast table till Mrs. Joe suddenly exclaimed,
"Why, there's a dog!"
And on the threshold of the door appeared a great deerhound, standing motionless, with his eyes fixed on Dan.
"Hello, old boy. Couldn't you wait till I came for you? Have you cut away on the sly? Own up now, and take your whipping like a man,"
said Dan, rising to meet the dog, who reared on his hind legs to look his master in the face and bark as if uttering an indignant denial of any disobedience.
"All right. Dawn never lies."
And Dan gave the tall beast a hug, adding, as he glanced out of the window, where a man and horse were seen approaching,
"I left my plunder at the hotel overnight, not knowing how I should find you. Come out and see Octu, my Mustang. She's a beauty."
And Dan was off, with the family streaming after him to welcome the newcomer. They found her preparing to go up the steps in her eagerness to reach her master, to the great dismay of the man who was holding her back.
"Let her come!"
called Dan.
"She climbs like a cat and jumps like a deer. Well, my girl, do you want to gallop?"
he asked, as the pretty creature clattered up to him and whinnied with pleasure as he rubbed her nose and slapped her glossy flank.
"That's what I call a horse worth having,"
said Ted, full of admiration and delight, for he was to have the care of her during Dan's absence.
"What intelligent eyes! She looks as if she would speak,"
said Mrs. Joe.
"She talks like a human in her way. Very little that she don't know. Hey, old lass?"
And Dan laid his cheek to hers as if the little black mare was very dear to him.
"What does Octu mean?"
asked Rob.
"Lightning. She deserves it, as you'll see. Black Hawk gave her to me for my rifle, and we've had high times together out yonder. She's saved my life more than once. Do you see that scar?"
Dan pointed to a small one, half hidden by the long mane, and standing with his arm about Octu's neck, he told the story of it.
"Black Hawk and I were after buffalo one time, but didn't find him as soon as we expected, so our food gave out, and there we were 100 miles from Red Deer River, where our camp was. I thought we were done for, but my brave pal says, 'Now I'll show you how we can live till we find the herds.' We were unsaddling for the night by a little pond. There wasn't a living creature in sight anywhere, not even a bird, and we could see for miles over the prairies. What do you think we did?"
And Dan looked into the faces round him.
"Ate worms like the Australian fellows,"
said Rob.
"Boiled grass or leaves,"
added Mrs. Joe.
"Perhaps fill the stomach with clay, as we read of savages doing,"
suggested Mr. Bear.
"Killed one of the horses!"
cried Ted, eager for bloodshed of some sort.
"No, but we bled one of 'em. See, just here. Fill a tin cup, put some wild sage leaves in it, with water, and heat it over a fire of sticks. It was good, and we slept well."
"I guess Octu didn't."
And Josie patted the animal with a face full of sympathy.
"I never minded it a bit. Black Hawk said we could live on the horses several days and still travel before they felt it. But by another morning we found the buffalo, and I shot the one whose head is in my box, ready to hang up and scare brats into fits. He's a fierce old fellow, you bet."
"What is this strap for?"
asked Ted, who was busy examining the Indian saddle, the single rein and snaffle with lariat, and round the neck the leather band he spoke of.
"We hold on to that when we lie along the horse's flank farthest from the enemy, and fire under the neck as we gallop round and round. I'll show you."
And springing into the saddle, Dan was off down the steps, tearing over the lawn at a great pace, sometimes on Octoo's back, sometimes half hidden as he hung by stirrup and strap, and sometimes off altogether, running beside her as she loped along, enjoying the fun immensely, while Don raced after, in a canine rapture at being free again and with his mates. It was a fine sight, the three wild things at play, so full of vigor, grace, and freedom that for the moment the smooth lawn seemed a prairie, and the spectators felt as if this glimpse of another life made their own seem rather tame and colorless.
"This is better than a circus,"
cried Mrs. Joe, wishing she were a girl again, that she might take a gallop on this chained lightning of a horse.
"I foresee that Nan will have her hands full setting bones, for Ted will break every one of his trying to rival Dan."
A few falls will not harm, and this new care and pleasure will be good for him in all ways. But I fear Dan will never follow a plow after riding a Pegasus like that,"
answered Mr. Bear, as the black mare leaped the gate and came flying up the avenue, to stop at a word and stand quivering with excitement, while Dan swung himself off and looked up for applause. He received plenty of it, and seemed more pleased for his pet's sake than for his own. Ted clamored for a lesson at once, and was soon at ease in the queer saddle, finding Octoo gentle as a lamb as he trotted away to show off at college. Bess came hastening down the hill, having seen the race from afar, and all collected on the piazza while Dan
yanked
the cover off the big box the express had
dumped
before the door, to borrow his own words. Dan usually traveled in light marching order, and hated to have more luggage than he could carry in his well-worn valise. But now that he had a little money of his own, he had cumbered himself with a collection of trophies, won by his bow and spear, and brought them home to bestow upon his friends.
"We shall be devoured with moths,"
thought Mrs. Joe, as the shaggy head appeared, followed by a wolfskin rug for her feet, a bearskin ditto for the professor's study, and Indian garments bedecked with foxes' tails for the boys. All nice and warm for a July day, but received with delight nevertheless. Ted and Josie immediately dressed up, learned the war whoop, and proceeded to astonish their friends by a series of skirmishes about the house and grounds, with tomahawks and bows and arrows, till weariness produced a lull. Gay birds' wings, plumy pampas grass, strings of wampum, and pretty work in beads, bark, and feathers pleased the girls. Minerals, arrowheads, and crude sketches interested the professor, and when the box was empty, Dan gave Mr. Lorry, as his gift, several plaintive Indian songs written on birch bark.
"We only want a tent over us to be quite perfect. I feel as if I ought to give you parched corn and dried meat for dinner, my braves. Nobody will want lamb and green peas after this splendid powwow,"
said Mrs. Joe, surveying the picturesque confusion of the long hall, where people lay about on the rugs, all more or less bedecked with feathers, moccasins, or beads.
Moose noses, buffalo tongues, bear steaks, and roasted marrow bones to be the thing, but I don't mind a change. So bring on your baba and green meat,"
answered Dan from the box, where he sat in state like a chief among his tribe, with the great hound at his feet. The girls began to clear up, but made little headway, for everything they touched had a story, and all were thrilling, comical, or wild, so they found it hard to settle to their work till Dan was carried off by Mr. Lorry. This was the beginning of the summer holiday, and it was curious to see what a pleasant little stir Dan's and Emile's coming made in the quiet life of the studious community, for they seemed to bring a fresh breeze with them that enlivened everyone. Many of the collegians remained during vacation, and Plumfield and Parnassus did their best to make these days pleasant for them, since most came from distant states, were poor, and had few opportunities but this for culture or amusement. Emile was hail fellow well met with men and maids, and went rollicking about in true sailor fashion. But Dan stood rather in awe of the fair girl graduates, and was silent when among them, eyeing them as an eagle might a flock of doves. He got on better with the young men, and was their hero at once. Their admiration for his manly accomplishments did him good, because he felt his educational defects keenly, and often wondered if he could find anything in books to satisfy him as thoroughly as did the lessons he was learning from Nature's splendidly illustrated volume. In spite of his silence, the girls found out his good qualities, and regarded the Spaniard, as they named him, with great favor, for his black eyes were more eloquent than his tongue, and the kind creatures tried to show their friendly interests in many charming ways. He saw this, and endeavored to be worthy of it, curbing his free speech, toning down his rough manners, and watching the effect of all he said and did, anxious to make a good impression. The social atmosphere warmed his lonely heart, the culture excited him to do his best, and the changes which had taken place during his absence, both in himself and others, made the old home seem like a new world. After the life in California, it was sweet and restful to be here, with these familiar faces round him, helping him to forget much that he regretted, and to resolve to deserve more entirely the confidence of these good fellows, the respect of these innocent girls. So there was riding, rowing, and picnicking by day, music, dancing, and plays by night, and everyone said there had not been so gay a vacation for years. Bess kept her promise, and let the dust gather on her beloved clay, while she went pleasuring with her mates, or studied music with her father, who rejoiced over the fresh roses in her cheeks, and the laughter which chased away the dreamy look she used to wear. Josie quarreled less with Ted, for Dan had a way of looking at her which quelled her instantly, and had almost as good an effect upon her rebellious cousin. But Octu did even more for the lively youth, who found that her charms entirely eclipsed those of the bicycle, which had been his heart's delight before. Early and late he rode this untiring beast, and began to gain flesh, to the great joy of his mother, who feared that her beanstalk was growing too fast for health. Demi, finding business dull, solaced his leisure by photographing everybody he could induce to sit or stand to him, producing some excellent pictures among many failures, for he had a pretty taste in grouping and endless patience. He might be said to view the world through the lens of his camera, and seemed to enjoy himself very much, squinting at his fellow beings from under a bit of black cambric. Dan was a treasure to him, for he took well, and willingly posed in his Mexican costume with horse and hound, and all wanted copies of these effective photographs. Bess also was a favorite sitter, and Demi received a prize at the amateur photographic exhibition for one of his cousin with all her hair about her face, which rose from the cloud of white lace draping the shoulders. These were freely handed round by the proud artist, and one copy had a tender little history yet to be told. Nat was snatching every minute he could get with Daisy before the long parting, and Mrs. Meg relented somewhat, feeling sure that absence would quite cure this unfortunate fancy. Daisy said little, but her gentle face was sad when she was alone, and a few quiet tears dropped on the handkerchiefs she marked so daintily with her own hair. She was sure Nat would not forget her, and life looked rather forlorn without the dear fellow who had been her friend since the days of patty pans and confidences in the willow tree. She was an old-fashioned daughter, dutiful and docile, with such love and reverence for her mother that her will was law, and if love was forbidden, friendship must suffice. So she kept her little sorrow to herself, smiled cheerfully at Nat, and made his last days of home life very happy with every comfort and pleasure she could give, from sensible advice and sweet words to a well-filled work-bag for his bachelor establishment and a box of goodies for the voyage. Tom and Nan took all the time they could spare from their studies to enjoy high jinks at Plumfield with their old friends, for Emile's next voyage was to be a long one, Nat's absence was uncertain, and no one ever knew when Dan would turn up again. They all seemed to feel that life was beginning to grow serious, and even while they enjoyed those lovely summer days together, they were conscious that they were children no longer, and often, in the pauses of their fun, talked soberly of their plans and hopes, as if anxious to know and help one another before they drifted farther apart on their different ways. A few weeks were all they had. Then the Brenda was ready. Nat was to sail from New York, and Dan went along to see him off, for his own plans fermented in his head, and he was eager to be up and doing. A farewell dance was given on Parnassus in honor of the travelers, and all turned out in their best array and gayest spirits. George and Dolly came with the latest Harvard airs and graces, radiant to behold, in dress suits and
crushed hats,
as Josie called the especial pride and joy of their boyish souls. Jack and Ned sent regrets and best wishes, and no one mourned their absence, for they were among what Mrs. Joe called her failures. Poor Tom got into trouble, as usual, by deluging his head with some highly scented preparation, in the vain hope of making his tight curls lie flat and smooth, as was the style. Unhappily, his rebellious crop only kinked the closer, and the odor of many barbers' shops clung to him, in spite of his frantic efforts to banish it. Nan wouldn't allow him near her, and flapped her fan vigorously whenever he was in sight, which cut him to the heart, and made him feel like the Peri shut out from paradise. Of course his mates jeered at him, and nothing but the unquenchable jollity of his nature kept him from despair. Emile was resplendent in his new uniform, and danced with an abandon which only sailors know. His pumps seemed to be everywhere, and his partners soon lost breath trying to keep up with him, but the girls all declared he steered like an angel, and in spite of his pace no collisions took place, so he was happy, and found no lack of damsels to ship with him. Having no dress suit, Dan had been coaxed to wear his Mexican costume, and feeling at ease in the many-buttoned trousers, loose jacket, and gay sash, flung his serape over his shoulder with a flourish and looked his best, doing great execution with his long spurs, as he taught Josie strange steps, or rolled his black eyes admiringly after certain blonde damsels whom he dared not address. The mammas sat in the alcove, supplying pins, smiles, and kindly words to all, especially the awkward youths new to such scenes, and the bashful girls conscious of faded muslins and cleaned gloves. It was pleasant to see stately Mrs. Amy promenade on the arm of a tall country boy with thick boots and a big forehead, or Mrs. Joe dance like a girl with a shy fellow whose arms went like pump handles and whose face was scarlet with confusion and pride at the honor of treading on the toes of the president's wife. Mrs. Meg always had room on her sofa for 2 or 3 girls, and Mr. Lorry devoted himself to these plain, poorly dressed damsels with a kindly grace that won their hearts and made them happy. The good professor circulated like refreshments, and his cheerful face shone on all alike, while Mr. March discussed Greek comedy in the study with such serious gentlemen as never unbent their mighty minds to frivolous joys. The long music room, parlor, hall, and piazza were full of white-gowned maidens with attendant shadows. The air was full of lively voices, and hearts and feet went lightly together as the home band played vigorously, and the friendly moon did her best to add enchantment to the scene.
Pin me up, Meg. That dear Dunbar boy has nearly rent me in sunder, as Mr. Peggotty would say. But didn't he enjoy himself, bumping against his fellow men, and swinging me round like a mop? On these occasions I find that I am not as young as I was, nor as light of foot. In 10 more years we shall be meal-bags, sister, so be resigned.
And Mrs. Joe subsided into a corner, much dishevelled by her benevolent exertions.
I know I shall be stout, but you won't keep still long enough to get much flesh on your bones, dear. And Amy will always keep her lovely figure. She looks about 18 tonight in her white gown and roses,"
answered Meg, busily pinning up one sister's torn frills, while her eyes fondly followed the other's graceful movements, for Meg still adored Amy in the old fashion. It was one of the family jokes that Joe was getting fat, and she kept it up, though as yet she had only acquired a matronly outline, which was very becoming. They were laughing over the impending double chins when Mr. Lorry came off duty for a moment.
"Repairing damages as usual, Joe? You never could take a little gentle exercise without returning in rags. Come and have a quiet stroll with me and cool off before supper. I have a series of pretty tableaux to show you while Meg listens to the raptures of lisping Miss Carr, whom I made happy by giving her Demi for a partner."
As he spoke, Laurie led Joe to the music room, nearly empty now after a dance which sent the young people into garden and hall. Pausing before the first of the 4 long windows that opened on a very wide piazza, he pointed to a group outside, saying,
"The name of this is Jack Ashore."
A pair of long blue legs, ending in very neat pumps, hung from the veranda roof among the vines, and roses, gathered by unseen hands, evidently appertaining to aforesaid legs, were being dropped into the laps of several girls, perched like a flock of white birds on the railing below, while a manly voice fell like a falling star as it sung this pensive ditty to a most appreciative audience.
The moon had climbed the eastern hill, which rises o'er the sands of Dee, and from its highest summit shed a silver light on tower and tree. When Mary laid her down to sleep, her thoughts on sandy far at sea, when soft and low a voice was heard, sang Mary, weep no more for me. She from her pillow gently raised her head to see who there might be, and saw young Sandy shivering stand, with visage pale and hollow-eyed. "O Mary, dear, cold is my clay, it lies beneath the stormy sea. Far, far from thee I sleep in death, dear Mary, weep no more for me. 3 stormy nights and stormy days we tossed upon the raging main, and long we strove our bark to save, but all our striving was in vain. E'en when terror chilled my blood, my heart was filled with love of thee. The storm is past and I'm at rest, so Mary, weep no more for me. O maiden dear, yourself prepare, we soon shall meet upon that shore, where love is free from doubt and care, and you and I shall part no more. Loud crew the cock, the shadow fled. No more her Sandy did she see, but soft the passing spirit said, Sweet Mary, weep no more for me.
The constant jollity of that boy is worth a fortune to him. He'll never sink with such a buoyant spirit to keep him afloat through life,"
said Mrs. Joe, as the roses were tossed back with much applause when the song ended.
Not he. And it's a blessing to be grateful for, isn't it? We moody people know its worth. Glad you like my first tableau. Come and see number 2. Hope it isn't spoiled. It was very pretty just now. This is Othello telling his adventures to Desdemona.
The second window framed a very picturesque group of 3. Mr. March in an armchair, with Bess on a cushion at his feet, was listening to Dan, who, leaning against a pillar, was talking with unusual animation. The old man was in shadow, but little Desdemona was looking up, with the moonlight full upon her, into young Othello's face, quite absorbed in the story he was telling so well. The gay drapery over Dan's shoulder, his dark coloring, and the gesture of his arm made the picture very striking, and both spectators enjoyed it with silent pleasure, till Mrs. Joe said, in a quick whisper,
"I'm glad he's going away. He's too picturesque to have here among so many romantic girls. Afraid his grand, gloomy, peculiar style will be too much for our simple maids."
No danger. Dan is in the rough as yet, and always will be, I fancy, though he is improving in many ways. How well Queenie looks in that soft light.
Dear little Goldilocks looks well everywhere.
And with a backward glance full of pride and fondness, Mrs. Joe went on, but that scene returned to her long afterward, and her own prophetic words also. Number 3 was a tragical tableau at first sight, and Mr. Lorry stifled a laugh as he whispered,
"The Wounded Knight,"
pointing to Tom, with his head enveloped in a large handkerchief, as he knelt before Nan, who was extracting a thorn or splinter from the palm of his hand with great skill, to judge from the patient's blissful expression of countenance.
"Do I hurt you?"
she asked, turning the hand to the moonlight for a better view.
Not a bit. Dig away. I like it,"
answered Tom, regardless of his aching knees and the damage done to his best trousers.
"I won't keep you long."
"Hours, if you please. Never so happy as here."
Quite unmoved by this tender remark, Nan put on a pair of large, round-eyed glasses, saying, in a matter-of-fact tone,
"Now I see it. Only a splinter, and there it is."
My hand is bleeding. Won't you bind it up?"
asked Tom, wishing to prolong the situation.
"Nonsense. Suck it. Only take care of it tomorrow if you dissect. Don't want any more blood poisoning."
That was the only time you were kind to me. Wish I'd lost my arm.
"I wish you'd lost your head. It smells more like turpentine and kerosene than ever. Do take a run in the garden and air it."
Fearing to betray themselves by laughter, the watchers went on, leaving the knight to rush away in despair, and the lady to bury her nose in the cup of a tall lily for refreshment.
Poor Tom, his fate is a hard one, and he's wasting his time. Do advise him to quit philandering and go to work, Joe.
"I have, Teddy, often, but it will take some great shock to make that boy wise. I wait with interest to see what it will be. Bless me, what is all this?"
She might well ask, for on a rustic stool stood Ted trying to pose on one foot, with the other extended, and both hands waving in the air. Josie, with several young mates, was watching his contortions with deep interest as they talked about
little wings,
gilded wire twisted,
and a
cunning skull cap.
This might be called Mercury trying to fly,
said Mr. Lorry, as they peeped through the lace curtains.
Bless the long legs of that boy. How does he expect to manage them? They are planning for the Owlsdark marbles, and a nice muddle they will make of my gods and goddesses, with no one to show them how.
answered Mrs. Joe, enjoying this scene immensely.
Now he's got it.
That's perfectly splendid.
See how long you can keep so,
cried the girls, as Ted managed to maintain his equilibrium a moment by resting one toe on the trellis. Unfortunately, this brought all his weight on the other foot. The straw seat of the stool gave way, and the flying Mercury came down with a crash, amid shrieks of laughter from the girls. Being accustomed to ground and lofty tumbling, he quickly recovered himself, and hopped gaily about, with one leg through the stool as he improvised a classic jig.
Thanks for 4 nice little pictures. You've given me an idea, and I think sometime we will get up a regular tableau of this sort, and march our company round a set of dissolving views. New and striking. I'll propose it to our manager, and give you all the glory,"
said Mrs. Joe, as they strolled towards the room whence came the clash of glass and china, and glimpses of agitated black coats. Let us follow the example of our old friends, and stroll about among the young people, eavesdropping, so gathering up various little threads to help in the weaving of the story. George and Dolly were at supper, and having served the ladies in their care, stood in a corner absorbing nourishment of all kinds, with a vain attempt to conceal hearty appetites under an air of elegant indifference.
"Good spread, this. Lawrence does things in style. First-rate coffee, but no wine, and that's a mistake,"
said Stuffy, who still deserved his name, and was a stout youth with a heavy eye and bilious complexion.
"Mad for boys," he says. "Jove! Wish he could see us at some of our wines. Don't we just splice the main brace, as Emil says?"
answered Dolly, the dandy, carefully spreading a napkin over the glossy expanse of shirt front, whereon a diamond stud shone like a lone star. His stutter was nearly outgrown, but he, as well as George, spoke in the tone of condescension, which, with the blasé airs they assumed, made a very funny contrast to their youthful faces and foolish remarks. Good-hearted little fellows both, but top-heavy with the pride of being sophs and the freedom that college life gave them.
"Little Joe is getting to be a deuced pretty girl, isn't she?"
said George, with a long sigh of satisfaction, as his first mouthful of ice went slowly down his throat.
Well, fairish. The princess is rather more to my taste. I like 'em blonde and queenly and elegant, don't you know?"
"Yeah, Joe is too lively. Might as well dance with a grasshopper. I've tried her, and she's one too many for me. Miss Perry is a nice, easy-going girl. Get her for the German."
"You'll never be a dancing man. Too lazy. Now I'll undertake to steer any girl and dance down any fellow you please. Dancing's my forte."
And Dolly glanced from his trim feet to his flashing gem with the defiant air of a young turkey-cock on parade.
"Miss Gray's looking for you. Wants more grub. Just see if Miss Nelson's plate is empty. There's a good fella. Can't eat ice in a hurry."
And George remained in his safe corner, while Dolly struggled through the crowd to do his duty, coming back in a fume, with a splash of salad dressing on his coat cuff.
"Confound these country chaps. They go blundering round like so many doorbugs and make a deuce of a mess. Better stick to books and not try to be society men. Can't do it. Beastly stain. Give it a rub and let me bolt a mouthful. I'm starved. Never saw girls eat such a lot. It proves that they ought not to study so much. Never liked co-ed,"
growled Dolly, much ruffled in spirit.
"So they do. Didn't ladylike. Ought to be satisfied with an ice and a bit of cake, and eat it prettily. Don't like to see a girl feed. We hard-working men need it, and by Jove, I mean to get some more of that meringue if it's not all gone. Here, waiter, bring along that dish over there, and be lively,"
commanded Stuffy, poking a young man in a rather shabby dress suit, who was passing with a tray of glasses. His order was obeyed promptly, but George's appetite was taken away the next moment by Dolly's exclaiming, as he looked up from his damaged coat, with a scandalized face,
"You've put your foot in it now, old boy. That's Morton, Mr. Bayer's crackman. Knows everything, no end of a dig, and bound to carry off all the honors. You won't hear the last of it in a hurry."
And Dolly laughed so heartily that a spoonful of ice flew upon the head of a lady sitting below him and got him into a scrape also. Leaving them to their despair, let us listen to the whispered chat of two girls comfortably seated in a recess, waiting till their escorts were fed.
"I do think the Lawrences give lovely parties. Don't you enjoy them?"
asked the younger, looking about her with the eager air of one unused to this sort of pleasure.
"Very much. Only I never feel as if I was dressed right. My things seemed elegant at home, and I thought I'd be overdressed if anything, but I look countrified and dowdy here. No time or money to change now, even if I knew how to do it,"
answered the other, glancing anxiously at her bright pink silk gown trimmed with cheap lace.
"You must get Mrs. Brooke to tell you how to fix your things. She was very kind to me. I had a green silk, and it looked so cheap and horrid by the side of the nice dresses here. I felt regularly unhappy about it, and asked her how much a dress like one Mrs. Lawrence had would cost. That looked so simple and elegant, I thought it wouldn't be costly. But it was India mull and Valenciennes lace, so of course I couldn't have it. Then Mrs. Brooke said, 'Get some muslin to cover the green silk, and wear hops or some white flowers instead of pink in your hair, and you will have a pretty suit.' Isn't it lovely and becoming?"
And Miss Burton surveyed herself with girlish satisfaction, for a little taste had softened the harsh green, and hop bells became her red hair better than roses.
"It's sweet. I've been admiring it. I'll do mine so, and ask about my purple one. Mrs. Brooke has helped me to get rid of my headaches, and Mary Clay's dyspepsia is all gone since she gave up coffee and hot bread."
Mrs. Lawrence advised me to walk and run and use the gymnasium to cure my round shoulders and open my chest, and I'm a much better figure than I was.
"Did you know that Mr. Lawrence pays all Amelia Merrill's bills? Her father failed, and she was heartbroken at having to leave college. But that splendid man just stepped in and made it all right."
Yes, and Professor Bear has several of the boys down at his house evenings to help them along so they can keep up with the rest. And Mrs. Bear took care of Charles Mackey herself when he had a fever last year. I do think they are the best and kindest people in the world.
"So do I. And my time here will be the happiest and most useful years of my life."
And both girls forgot their gowns and their suppers for a moment to look with grateful, affectionate eyes at the friends who tried to care for bodies and for souls as well as minds. Now come to a lively party supping on the stairs, girls like foam at the top, and a substratum of youths below, where the heaviest particles always settle. Emile, who never sat if he could climb or perch, adorned the newel post. Tom, Nat, Demi, and Dan were camped on the steps, eating busily, as their ladies were well served, and they had earned a moment's rest, which they enjoyed with their eyes fixed on the pleasing prospect above them.
I'm so sorry the boys are going. It will be dreadfully dull without them. Now they have stopped teasing and are polite, I really enjoy them,"
said Nan, who felt unusually gracious tonight, as Tom's mishap kept him from annoying her.
"So do I. And Bess was mourning about it today, though as a general thing she doesn't like boys unless they are models of elegance. She's been doing Dan's head, and it is not quite finished. I never saw her so interested in any work, and it's very well done. He is so striking and big he always makes me think of the Dying Gladiator, or some of those antique creatures. There's Bess now. Dear child, how sweet she looks tonight,"
answered Daisy, waving her hand as the princess went by with Grandpa on her arm.
"I never thought he would turn out so well. Don't you remember how we used to call him the bad boy, and be sure he would become a pirate or something awful because he glared at us and swore sometimes? Now he is the handsomest of all the boys, and very entertaining with his stories and plans. I like him very much. He's so big and strong and independent. I'm tired of mollycoddles and bookworms,"
said Nan in her decided way.
"Not handsomer than Nat,"
cried loyal Daisy, contrasting two faces below, one unusually gay, the other sentimentally sober even in the act of munching cake.
I like Dan, and I'm glad he's doing well, but he tires me and I'm still a little afraid of him. Quiet people suit me best.
Life is a fight, and I like a good soldier. Boys take things too easily, don't see how serious it all is, and go to work in earnest. Look at that absurd Tom, wasting his time in making an object of himself just because he can't have what he wants, like a baby crying for the moon. I've no patience with such nonsense,"
scolded Nan, looking down at the jovial Thomas, who was playfully putting macaroons in Emile's shoes and trying to beguile his exile as best he could.
Most girls would be touched by such fidelity. I think it's beautiful,"
said Daisy behind her fan, for other girls sat just below.
"You are a sentimental goose and not a judge. Nat will be twice the man when he comes back after his trip. I wish Tom was going with him. My idea is that if we girls have any influence we should use it for the good of these boys, and not pamper them up, making slaves of ourselves and tyrants of them. Let them prove what they can do and be before they ask anything of us, and give us a chance to do the same. Then we will know where we are, and shall not make mistakes to mourn over all our lives."
"Here, here!"
cried Alice Heath, who was a girl after Nan's own heart and had chosen a career, like a brave and sensible young woman.
"Only give us a chance, and have patience till we can do our best. Now we are expected to be as wise as men who have had generations of all the help there is, and we scarcely anything. Let us have equal opportunities, and in a few generations we will see what the judgment is. I like justice, and we get very little of it."
Still shouting the battle cry of freedom,
asked Demi, peering through the banisters at this moment.
"Up with your flag. I'll stand by and lend a hand if you want it. With you and Nan to lead the van, I think you won't need much help."
"You are a great comfort, Demi, and I'll call on you in all emergencies, for you are an honest boy, and don't forget that you owe much to your mother and your sisters and your aunts,"
continued Nan.
"I do like men who come out frankly and own that they are not gods. How can we think them so when such awful mistakes are being made all the time by these great creatures? See them sick as I do, then you know them."
"Don't hit us when we are down. Be merciful, and set us up to bless and believe in you evermore,"
pleaded Demi from behind the bars.
"We'll be kind to you if you will be just to us. I don't say generous, only just. I went to a suffrage debate in the legislature last winter, and of all the feeble, vulgar twaddle I ever heard that was the worst, and those men were our representatives. I blushed for them and the wives and mothers. I want an intelligent man to represent me if I can't do it myself, not a fool."
"Nan is on the stump. Now we shall catch it,"
cried Tom, putting up an umbrella to shield his unhappy head, for Nan's earnest voice was audible, and her indignant eye happened to rest on him as she spoke.
Go on, I'll take notes, and put in great applause liberally,"
added Demi, producing his ball book and pencil with his Jenkins air. Daisy pinched his nose through the bars, and the meeting was rather tumultuous for a moment, for Emile called,
"Avast, avast, here's a squall to wind'ard."
Tom applauded wildly. Dan looked up as if the prospect of a fight, even with words, pleased him, and Nat went to support Demi, as his position seemed to be a good one. At this crisis, when everyone laughed and talked at once, Bess came floating through the upper hall and looked down like an angel of peace upon the noisy group below, as she asked, with wondering eyes and smiling lips,
"What is it?"
"An indignation meeting. Nan and Alice are on the rampage, and we are at the bar to be tried for our lives. Will your Highness preside and judge between us?"
answered Demi, as a lull at once took place, for no one rioted in the presence of the princess.
"I'm not wise enough. I'll sit here and listen. Please go on."
And Bess took her place above them all, as cool and calm as a little statue of justice, with fan and nosegay in place of sword and scales.
"Now, ladies, free your minds. Only spare us till morning. For we've got a German to dance as soon as everyone is fed, and Parnassus expects every man to do his duty. Mrs. President Giddy-Gaddy has the floor,"
said Demi, who liked this sort of fun better than the very mild sort of flirtation which was allowed at Plumfield, for the simple reason that it could not be entirely banished, and is a part of all education, co or otherwise.
I have only one thing to say, and it is this,"
began Nan, soberly, though her eyes sparkled with a mixture of fun and earnestness.
"I want to ask every boy of you what you really think on this subject. Dan and Emile have seen the world and ought to know their own minds. Tom and Nat have had 5 examples before them for years. Demi is ours, and we are proud of him. So is Rob. Ted is a weathercock, and Dolly and George, of course, are fogies in spite of the annex, and girls at Girton going ahead of the men. Commodore, are you ready for the question?"
Aye, aye, Skipper.
"Do you believe in women's suffrage?"
Bless your pretty figurehead. I do, and I'll ship a crew of girls any time you say so. Aren't they worse than a press gang to carry a fellow out of his moorings? Don't we all need one as pilot to steer us safe to port? And why shouldn't they share our mess afloat and ashore, since we are sure to be wrecked without 'em?
Good for you, Emile. Nan will take you for first mate after that handsome speech,"
said Demi, as the girls applauded, and Tom glowered.
"Now, Dan, you love liberty so well yourself. Are you willing that we should have it?"
All you can get, and I'll fight any man who's mean enough to say you don't deserve it.
This brief and forcible reply delighted the energetic president, and she beamed upon the member from California as she said briskly,
"Nat wouldn't dare to say he was on the other side, even if he were, but I hope he has made up his mind to pipe for us, at least when we take the field, and not be one of those who wait till the battle is won, and then beat the drums and share the glory."
Mrs. Giddy-Gaddy's doubts were most effectually removed, and her sharp speech regretted, as Nat looked up blushing, but with a new sort of manliness in face and manner, saying, in a tone that touched them all,
"I should be the most ungrateful fellow alive if I did not love, honor, and serve women with all my heart and might, for to them I owe everything I am or ever shall be."
Daisy clapped her hands, and Bess threw her bouquet into Nat's lap, while the other girls waved their fans, well pleased, for real feeling made his little speech eloquent.
"Thomas B. Bangs, come into court and tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, if you can,"
commanded Nan, with a rap to call the meeting to order. Tom shut the umbrella, and standing up raised his hand, saying solemnly,
I believe in suffrage of all kinds. I adore all women, and will die for them at any moment if it will help the cause.
"Living and working for it is harder, and therefore more honorable. Men are always ready to die for us, but not to make our lives worth having. Cheap sentiment and bad logic. You will pass, Tom, only don't twaddle. Now, having taken the sense of the meeting, we will adjourn, as the hour for festive gymnastics has arrived. I am glad to see that old Plum has given 6 true men to the world, and hope that they will continue to be staunch to her in the principles she has taught them, wherever they may go. Now, girls, don't sit in draughts, and boys, beware of ice water when you are warm."
With this characteristic close, Nan retired from office, and the girls went to enjoy one of the few rights allowed them. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Joe's Boys by Louisa May Alcott. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Joe's Boys by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 6 Last Words. The next day was Sunday, and a goodly troop of young and old set forth to church, some driving, some walking, all enjoying the lovely weather and the happy quietude which comes to refresh us when the work and worry of the week are over. Daisy had a headache, and Aunt Jo remained at home to keep her company, knowing very well that the worst ache was in the tender heart, struggling dutifully against the love that grew stronger as the parting drew nearer.
Daisy knows my wishes, and I trust her. You must keep an eye on Nat, and let him clearly understand that there is to be no lovering, or I shall forbid the letter-writing. I hate to seem cruel, but it is too soon for my dear girl to bind herself in any way,"
said Mrs. Meg, as she rustled about in her best gray silk, while waiting for Demi, who always escorted his pious mother to church as a peace offering for crossing her wishes in other things.
"I will, dear. I'm lying in wait for all 3 boys today, like an old spider, and I will have a good talk with each. They know I understand them, and they always open their hearts sooner or later. You look like a nice, plump little Quakeress, Meg,
and no one will believe that big boy is your son,"
added Mrs. Joe, as Demi came in shining with Sunday neatness from his well-blacked boots to his smooth brown head.
"You flatter me to soften my heart toward your boy. I know your ways, Joe, and I don't give in. Be firm, and spare me a scene by and by. As for John, as long as he is satisfied with his old mother, I don't care what people think,"
answered Mrs. Meg, accepting with a smile the little posy of sweet peas and mignonette Demi brought her. Then, having buttoned her dove-colored gloves with care, she took her son's arm and went proudly away to the carriage, where Amy and Bess waited, while Joe called after them, just as Marmee used to do.
"Girls, have you got nice pocket handkerchiefs?"
They all smiled at the familiar words, and 3 white banners waved as they drove away, leaving the spider to watch for her first fly. She did not wait long. Daisy was lying down with a wet cheek on the little hymn book out of which she and Nat used to sing together. So Mrs. Joe strolled about the lawn, looking very like a wandering mushroom with her large buff umbrella. Dan had gone for a 10-mile stroll, and Nat was supposed to have accompanied him, but presently came sneaking back, unable to tear himself away from the dovecote, or lose a moment of nearness to his idol that last day. Mrs. Joe saw him at once, and beckoned him to a rustic seat under the old elm, where they could have their confidences undisturbed, and both keep an eye on a certain white-curtained window, half hidden in vines.
Nice and cool here. I'm not up to one of Dan's tramps today. It's so warm, and he goes so like a steam engine. He's headed for the swamp, where his pet snake used to live, and I begged to be excused,"
said Nat, fanning himself with his straw hat, though the day was not oppressive.
"I'm glad you did. Sit and rest with me, and have one of our good old talks. We've both been so busy lately. I feel as if I didn't half know your plans, and I want to,"
answered Mrs. Joe, feeling sure that, though they might start with Leipzig, they would bring up at Plumfield.
"You are very kind, and there's nothing I'd like better. I don't realize I'm going so far. Suppose I shan't till I get afloat. It's a splendid start, and I don't know how I can ever thank Mr. Lorry for all he's done, or you either,"
added Nat, with a break in his voice, for he was a tender-hearted fellow, and never forgot a kindness.
"You can thank us beautifully, by being and doing all we hope and expect of you, my dear. In the new life you are going to, there will be 1,000 trials and temptations, and only your own wit and wisdom to rely on. That will be the time to test the principles we have tried to give you, and see how firm they are. Of course, you will make mistakes. We all do. But don't let go of your conscience and drift along blindly. Watch and pray, dear Nat, and while your hand gains skill, let your head grow wiser, and keep your heart as innocent and warm as it is now."
"I'll try, Mother Bear, my very best to be a credit to you. I know I shall improve in my music. Can't help it there, but I never shall be very wise, I'm afraid. As for my heart, you know, I leave it behind me in good keeping."
As he spoke, Nat's eyes were fixed on the window with a look of love and longing that made his quiet face both manly and sad, plainly showing how strong a hold this boyish affection had upon him.
"I want to speak of that, and I know you will forgive what seems hard, because I do most heartily sympathize with you,"
said Mrs. Joe, glad to have her say.
"Yes, do talk about Daisy. I think of nothing but leaving and losing her. I have no hope. I suppose it is too much to ask, only I can't help loving her, wherever I am,"
cried Nat, with a mixture of defiance and despair in his face that rather startled Mrs. Joe.
"Listen to me, and I'll try to give you both comfort and good advice. We all know that Daisy is fond of you, but her mother objects, and being a good girl she tries to obey. Young people think they never can change, but they do in the most wonderful manner, and very few die of broken hearts."
Mrs. Joe smiled as she remembered another boy whom she had once tried to comfort, and then went soberly on, while Nat listened as if his fate hung upon her lips.
One of two things will happen. You will find someone else to love, or, better still, be so busy and happy in your music that you will be willing to wait for time to settle the matter for you both. Daisy will perhaps forget when you are gone, and be glad you are only friends. At any rate, it is much wiser to have no promises made, then both are free, and in a year or two may meet to laugh over the little romance nipped in the bud.
Do you honestly think that?
Asked Nat, looking at her so keenly that the truth had to come, for all his heart was in those frank blue eyes of his.
No, I don't,
answered Mrs. Joe.
Then, if you were in my place, what would you do?
He added, with a tone of command never heard in his gentle voice before.
Bless me, the boy is in dead earnest, and I shall forget prudence in sympathy, I'm afraid,
thought Mrs. Joe, surprised and pleased by the unexpected manliness Nat showed.
I'll tell you what I should do. I'd say to myself, I'll prove that my love is strong and faithful, and make Daisy's mother proud to give her to me by being not only a good musician, but an excellent man, and so command respect and confidence. This I will try for, and if I fail, I shall be the better for the effort, and find comfort in the thought that I did my best for her sake.
That is what I meant to do, but I wanted a word of hope to give me courage,
cried Nat, firing up as if the smoldering spark was set ablaze by a breath of encouragement.
Other fellows, poorer and stupider than I, have done great things and come to honor. Why may not I? Though I'm nothing now. I know Mrs. Brooke remembers what I came from. But my father was honest though everything went wrong, and I have nothing to be ashamed of, though I was a charity boy. I never will be ashamed of my people or myself, and I'll make other folks respect me if I can.
Good. That's the right spirit, Nat. Hold to it, and make yourself a man. No one will be quicker to see and admire the brave work than my sister Meg. She does not despise your poverty or your past, but mothers are very tender over their daughters, and we Marches, though we have been poor, are, I confess, a little proud of our good family. We don't care for money, but a long line of virtuous ancestors is something to desire and to be proud of.
Well, the Blakes are a good lot. I've looked them up, and not one was ever in prison, hanged, or disgraced in any way. We used to be rich and honored years ago, but we've died out and got poor, and father was a street musician rather than beg, and I'll be one again before I do the mean things some men do and pass muster.
Nat was so excited that Mrs. Joe indulged in a laugh to calm him, and both went on more quietly.
I told my sister all that, and it pleased her. I am sure if you do well these next few years, that she will relent, and all be happily settled, unless that wonderful change, which you don't believe possible, should occur. Now, cheer up. Don't be lackadaisical and blue. Say good-bye cheerfully and bravely, show a manly front, and leave a pleasant memory behind you. We all wish you well, and hope much for you. Write to me every week, and I'll send a good gossipy answer. Be careful what you write to Daisy. Don't gush or wail, for Sister Meg will see the letters. And you can help your cause very much by sending sensible, cheery accounts of your life to us all.
I will. It looks brighter and better already, and I won't lose my one comfort by any fault of my own. Thank you so much, Mother Bear, for taking my side. I felt so ungrateful and mean and crushed when I thought you all considered me a sneak who had no business to love such a precious girl as Daisy. No one said anything, but I know how you felt, and that Mr. Lorry sent me off partly to get me out of the way. Oh dear, life is pretty tough sometimes, isn't it?
And Nat took his head in both hands as if it ached with the confusion of hopes and fears, passions and plans that proved boyhood was past and manhood had begun.
Very tough, but it is that struggle with obstacles which does us good. Things have been made easy for you in many ways, but no one can do everything. You must paddle your own canoe now, and learn to avoid the rapids, and steer straight to the port you want to reach. I don't know just what your temptations will be, for you have no bad habits, and seem to love music so well, nothing can lure you from it. I only hope you won't work too hard.
I feel as if I could work like a horse. I'm so eager to get on. But I'll take care. Can't waste time being sick, and you've given me doses enough to keep me all right, I guess.
Nat laughed as he remembered the book of directions Mrs. Joe had written for him to consult on all occasions. She immediately added some verbal ones on the subject of foreign messes, and having mounted one of her pet hobbies, was in full gallop when Emile was seen strolling about on the roof of the old house, that being his favorite promenade, for there he could fancy himself walking the deck, with only blue sky and fresh air about him.
I want a word with the Commodore, and up there shall be nice and quiet. Go and play to Daisy. It will put her to sleep and do you both good. Sit in the porch, so I can keep an eye on you as I promised.
And with a motherly pat on the shoulder, Mrs. Joe left Nat to his delightful task, and briskly ascended to the housetop, not up the trellis as of old, but by means of the stairs inside. Emerging on the platform, she found Emile cutting his initials afresh in the woodwork, and singing "Pull for the Shore," like the tuneful mariner he was.
"Come aboard and make yourself at home, Auntie,"
he said, with a playful salute.
"I'm just leaving a PPC in the old place, so when you fly up here for refuge, you'll remember me."
Ah, my dear, I'm not likely to forget you. It doesn't need EBH cut on all the trees and railings to remind me of my sailor boy.
And Mrs. Joe took the seat nearest the blue figure astride the balustrade, not quite sure how to begin the little sermon she wanted to preach.
"Well, you don't pipe your eye and look squally when I sheer off as you used to, and that's a comfort. I like to leave port in fair weather and have a jolly send-off all round, especially this time, for it will be a year or more before we drop anchor here again,"
answered Emile, pushing his cap back and glancing about him, as if he loved Old Plum and would be sorry never to see it any more.
You have salt water enough without my adding to it. I'm going to be quite a Spartan mother, and send my sons to battle with no wailing, only the command, "With your shield or on it,"
said Mrs. Joe cheerfully, adding, after a pause,
"I often wish I could go too, and some day I will, when you are captain and have a ship of your own, as I've no doubt you will before long, with Uncle Herman to push you on."
"When I do, I'll christen her the Jolly Joe, and take you as first mate. It would be regular larks to have you aboard, and I'd be a proud man to carry you round the world you've wanted to see so long and never could,"
answered Emile, caught at once by this splendid vision.
"I'll make my first voyage with you, and enjoy myself immensely in spite of seasickness and all the stormy winds that blow. I've always thought I'd like to see a wreck, a nice safe one with all saved after great danger and heroic deeds, while we clung, like Mr. Pillicoddy, to maintop jibs and lee scuppers."
"No wrecks yet, ma'am, but we'll try to accommodate customers. Captain says I'm a lucky dog and bring fair weather, so we'll save the dirty weather for you, if you want it,"
laughed Emile, digging at the ship in full sail which he was adding to his design.
"Thanks. I hope you will. This long voyage will give you new experiences, and being an officer, you will have new duties and responsibilities. Are you ready for them? You take everything so gaily. I've been wondering if you realized that now you will have not only to obey but to command also, and power is a dangerous thing. Be careful that you don't abuse it, or let it make a tyrant of you."
"Right you are, ma'am. I've seen plenty of that, and have got my bearings pretty well, I guess. I shan't have very wide swing with Peters over me, but I'll see that the boys don't get abused when he's bowsed up his jib. No right to speak before, but now I won't stand it."
That sounds mysteriously awful. Could I ask what nautical torture bowsing jibs is?
asked Mrs. Joe, in a tone of deep interest.
Getting drunk. Peters can hold more grog than any man I ever saw. He keeps right side up, but is as savage as a norther, and makes things lively all round. I've seen him knock a fellow down with a belaying pin, and couldn't lend a hand. Better luck now, I hope.
And Emile frowned as if he already trod the quarter-deck, lord of all he surveyed.
Don't get into trouble, for even Uncle Herman's favor won't cover insubordination, you know. You have proved yourself a good sailor. Now be a good officer, which is a harder thing, I fancy. It takes a fine character to rule justly and kindly, and you will have to put by your boyish ways and remember your dignity. That will be excellent training for you, Emil, and sober you down a bit. No more skylarking, except here. So mind your ways, and do honor to your buttons,
said Mrs. Joe, tapping one of the very bright brass ones that ornamented the new suit Emile was so proud of.
I'll do my best. I know my time for skirmshander
Chaff
is over, and I must steer a straighter course. But don't you fear. Jack ashore is a very different craft from what he is with blue water under his keel. I had a long talk with Uncle last night and got my orders. I won't forget him, nor all I owe him. As for you, I'll name my first ship as I say, and have your bust for the figurehead. See if I don't.
And Emile gave his aunt a hearty kiss to seal the vow, which proceeding much amused Nat, playing softly in the porch of the Dovecote.
You do me proud, Captain. But, dear, I want to say one thing, and then I'm done, for you don't need much advice of mine after my good man has spoken. I read somewhere that every inch of rope used in the British Navy has a strand of red in it, so that wherever a bit is found, it is known. That is the text of my little sermon to you. Virtue, which means honor, honesty, courage, and all that makes character, is the red thread that marks a good man wherever he is. Keep that always and everywhere, so that even if wrecked by misfortune, that sign shall still be found and recognized. Yours is a rough life, and your mate's not all we could wish. But you can be a gentleman in the true sense of the word, and no matter what happens to your body, keep your soul clean and your heart true to those who love you, and do your duty to the end.
As she spoke, Emile had risen and stood listening with his cap off and a grave, bright look, as if taking orders from a superior officer. When she ended, he answered briefly but heartily,
Please God, I will.
That's all. I have little fear for you, but one never knows when or how the weak moment may come, and sometimes a chance word helps us, as so many my dear mothers spoke come back to me now for my own comfort and the guidance of my boys,
said Mrs. Joe, rising, for the words had been said and no more were needed.
I've stored 'em up, and know where to find 'em when wanted. Often and often in my watch I've seen old Plum, and heard you and Uncle talking so plainly I'd have sworn I was here. It is a rough life, Auntie, but a wholesome one if a fellow loves it as I do, and as an anchor to windward as I have. Don't worry about me, and I'll come home next year with a chest of tea that will cheer your heart, and give you ideas enough for a dozen novels. Going below? All right, steady in the gangway. I'll be along by the time you've got out the cake box. Last chance for a good old lunch ashore.
Mrs. Joe descended laughing, and Emile finished his ship whistling cheerfully, neither dreaming when and where this little chat on the housetop would return to the memory of one of them. Dan was harder to catch, and not until evening did a quiet moment come in that busy family, when, while the rest were roaming about, Mrs. Joe sat down to read in the study, and presently Dan looked in at the window.
Come and rest after your long tramp. You must be tired,
she called, with an inviting nod towards the big sofa where so many boys had reposed, as much as that active animal ever does.
Afraid I shall disturb you.
But Dan looked as if he wanted to stay his restless feet somewhere.
Not a bit. I'm always ready to talk. Shouldn't be a woman if I were not.
laughed Mrs. Joe, as Dan swung himself in and sat down with an air of contentment very pleasant to see.
Last day's over, yet somehow I don't seem to hanker to be off. Generally I'm rather anxious to cut loose after a short stop. Odd, ain't it?
Asked Dan, gravely picking grass and leaves out of his hair and beard, for he had been lying on the grass, thinking many thoughts in the quiet summer night.
Not at all. You are beginning to get civilized. It's a good sign, and I'm glad to see it,
answered Mrs. Joe promptly.
You've had your swing and want change. Hope the farming will give it to you, though helping the Indians pleases me more. It is so much better to work for others than for oneself alone.
So 'tis,
assented Dan heartily.
I seem to want to root somewhere and have folks of my own to take care of. Tired of my own company, I suppose, now I've seen so much better. I'm a rough, ignorant lot, and I've been thinking maybe I've missed it loafing round creation, instead of going in for education as the other chaps did. Eh?
He looked anxiously at Mrs. Joe, and she tried to hide the surprise this new outburst caused her, for till now Dan had scorned books and gloried in his freedom.
No, I don't think so in your case. So far I'm sure the free life was best. Now that you are a man, you can control that lawless nature better. But as a boy, only great activity and much adventure could keep you out of mischief. Time is taming my colt, you see, and I shall yet be proud of him, whether he makes a pack-horse of himself to carry help to the starving, or goes to ploughing as Pegasus did.
Dan liked the comparison, and smiled as he lounged in the sofa corner with the new thoughtfulness in his eyes.
Glad you think so. The fact is, it's going to take a heap of taming to make me go well in harness anywhere. I want to, and I try now and then, but always kick over the traces and run away. No lives lost yet, but I shouldn't wonder if there was some time, in a general smash-up.
Why, Dan, did you have any dangerous adventures during the last absence? I fancied so, but didn't ask before, knowing you'd tell me if I could help in any way. Can I?
And Mrs. Joe looked anxiously at him, for a sudden lowering expression had come into his face, and he leaned forward as if to hide it.
Nothing very bad. But Frisco isn't just a heaven on earth, you know, and it's harder to be a saint there than here,
he answered slowly. Then, as if he had made up his mind to "fess," as the children used to say, he sat up and added rapidly, in a half-defiant, half-shamefaced way,
I tried gambling, and it wasn't good for me.
Was that how you made your money?
Not a penny of it. That's all honest. If speculation isn't a bigger sort of gambling. I won a lot, but I lost or gave it away, and cut the whole concern before it got the better of me.
Thank heaven for that. Don't try it again. It may have the terrible fascination for you it has for so many. Keep to your mountains and prairies and shun cities, if these things tempt you, Dan. Better lose your life than your soul, and one such passion leads to worse sins, as you know better than I.
Dan nodded, and seeing how troubled she was, said in a lighter tone, though still the shadow of that past experience remained,
Don't be scared. I'm all right now, and a burnt dog dreads the fire. I don't drink, or do the things you dread, don't care for 'em. But I get excited, and then this devilish temper of mine is more than I can manage. Fighting a moose or a buffalo is all right, but when you pitch into a man, no matter how great a scamp he is, you got to look out. I shall kill someone some day. That's all I'm afraid of. I do hate a sneak.
And Dan brought his fist down on the table with a blow that made the lamp totter and the books skip.
That always was your trial, Dan, and I can sympathize with you, for I've been trying to govern my own temper all my life, and haven't learned yet,
said Mrs. Joe with a sigh.
For heaven's sake, guard your demon well, and don't let a moment's fury ruin all your life. As I said to Nat, watch and pray, my dear boy. There is no other help or hope for human weakness but God's love and patience.
Tears were in Mrs. Joe's eyes as she spoke, for she felt this deeply, and knew how hard a task it is to rule these bosom sins of ours. Dan looked touched, also uncomfortable, as he always did when religion of any sort was mentioned, though he had a simple creed of his own, and tried to live up to it in his blind way.
I don't do much praying. It don't seem to come handy to me. But I can watch like a redskin, only it's easier to mount guard over a lurking grizzly than my own cursed temper. It's that I'm afraid of, if I settle down. I can get on with wild beasts first rate, but men rile me awfully, and I can't take it out in a free fight, as I can with a bear or a wolf. Guess I'd better head for the Rockies and stay there a spell longer, till I'm tame enough for decent folks, if I ever am.
And Dan leaned his rough head on his hands in a despondent attitude.
Try my sort of help, and don't give up. Read more, study a little, and try to meet a better class of people who won't rile, but soothe and strengthen you. We don't make you savage, I'm sure, for you have been as meek as a lamb, and made us very happy.
Glad of it, but I've felt like a hawk in a henhouse all the same, and wanted to pounce and tear more than once. Not so much as I used, though,
added Dan, after a short laugh at Mrs. Joe's surprised face.
I'll try your plan, and keep good company this bout if I can. But a man can't pick and choose, knocking about as I do.
Yes, you can this time, for you're going on a peaceful errand, and can keep clear of temptation if you try. Take some books and read. That's an immense help, and books are always good company if you have the right sort. Let me pick out some for you.
And Mrs. Joe made a bee-line to the well-laden shelves, which were the joy of her heart and the comfort of her life.
Give me travels and stories, please. Don't want any pious works. Can't seem to relish 'em, and won't pretend I do,
said Dan, following to look over her head with small favor at the long lines of well-worn volumes. Mrs. Joe turned short round, and putting a hand on either broad shoulder, looked him in the eye, saying soberly,
Now, Dan, see here. Never sneer at good things, or pretend to be worse than you are. Don't let false shame make you neglect the religion without which no man can live. You needn't talk about it if you don't like, but don't shut your heart to it in whatever shape it comes. Nature is your God now. She has done much for you. Let her do more, and lead you to know and love a wiser and more tender teacher, friend, and comforter than she can ever be. That is your only hope. Don't throw it away and waste time, for sooner or later you will feel the need of him, and he will come to you and hold you up when all other help fails.
Dan stood motionless, and let her read in his softened eyes the dumb desire that lived in his heart, though he had no words to tell it, and only permitted her to catch a glimpse of the divine spark which smoulders or burns clearly in every human soul. He did not speak, and glad to be spared some answer which should belie his real feelings, Mrs. Joe hastened to say, with her most motherly smile,
I saw in your room the little Bible I gave you long ago. It was well worn outside, but fresh within, as if not read much. Will you promise me to read a little once a week, dear, for my sake? Sunday is a quiet day everywhere, and this book is never old nor out of place. Begin with the stories you used to love when I told them to you as boys. David was your favorite, you remember? Read him again, and he'll suit you even better now, and you'll find his sins and repentance useful reading till you come to the life and work of a diviner example than he. You will do it for love of Mother Bear, who always loved her firebrand and hoped to save him?
I will,
answered Dan, with a sudden brightening of face that was like a sunburst through a cloud, full of promise, though so short-lived and rare. Mrs. Joe turned at once to the books and began to talk of them, knowing well that Dan would not hear any more just then. He seemed relieved, for it was always hard for him to show his inner self, and he took pride in hiding it, as an Indian does in concealing pain or fear.
Hello, here's old Sintram. I remember him. I used to like him and his tantrums, and read about him to Ted. There he is riding ahead with death and the devil alongside.
As Dan looked at the little picture of the young man with horse and hound going bravely up the rocky defile, accompanied by the companions who ride beside most men through this world, a curious impulse made Mrs. Joe say, quickly,
"Thank you, Dan. Just you at this time. Danger and sin are near you in the life you lead. Moods and passions torment you. The bad father left you to fight alone, and the wild spirit drives you to wander up and down the world looking for peace and self-control. Even the horse and hound are there, your Octo and Dawn, faithful friends, unscared by the strange mates that go with you. You have not got the armor yet, but I'm trying to show you where to find it. Remember the mother Sintram loved and longed to find, and did find when his battle was bravely fought, his reward well earned? You can recollect your mother, and I have always felt that all the good qualities you possess come from her. Act out the beautiful old story in this as in the other parts, and try to give her back a son to be proud of."
Quite carried away by the likeness of the quaint tale to Dan's life and needs, Mrs. Joe went on pointing to the various pictures which illustrated it, and when she looked up was surprised to see how struck and interested he seemed to be. Like all people of his temperament, he was very impressionable, and his life among hunters and Indians had made him superstitious. He believed in dreams, liked weird tales, and whatever appealed to the eye or mind vividly impressed him more than the wisest words. The story of poor, tormented Sintram came back clearly as he looked and listened, symbolizing his secret trials even more truly than Mrs. Joe knew, and just at that moment this had an effect upon him that never was forgotten. But all he said was,
"Small chance of that. I don't take much stock in the idea of meeting folks in heaven. Guess Mother won't remember the poor little brat she left so long ago. Why should she?"
Because true mothers never forget their children. And I know she was one, from the fact that she ran away from a cruel husband to save her little son from bad influences. Had she lived, life would have been happier for you, with this tender friend to help and comfort you. Never forget that she risked everything for your sake, and don't let it be in vain.
Mrs. Joe spoke very earnestly, knowing that this was the one sweet memory of Dan's early life, and glad to have recalled it at this moment, for suddenly a great tear splashed down on the page where Sintram kneels at his mother's feet, wounded but victorious over sin and death. She looked up, well pleased to have touched Dan to the heart's core, as that drop proved, but a sweep of the arm brushed away the telltale, and his beard hid the mate to it as he shut the book, saying, with a suppressed quiver in his strong voice,
"I'll keep this if nobody wants it. I'll read it over, and maybe it will do me good. I'd like to meet her anywhere, but don't believe I ever shall."
Keep it, and welcome. My mother gave it to me, and when you read it, try to believe that neither of your mothers will ever forget you.
Mrs. Joe gave the book with a caress, and simply saying,
"Thanks. Good night,"
Dan thrust it into his pocket, and walked straight away to the river to recover from this unwonted mood of tenderness and confidence. Next day the travellers were off. All were in good spirits, and a cloud of handkerchiefs whitened the air as they drove away in the old bus, waving their hats to everyone and kissing their hands, especially to Mother Bear, who said, in her prophetic tone as she wiped her eyes, when the familiar rumble died away,
"I have a feeling that something is going to happen to some of them, and they will never come back to me, or come back changed. Well, I can only say, God be with my boys."
And he was. End of chapter 6.